The man crouched in the rows of vines had done nothing but lift a cluster of grapes to check the fruit, and the tasting room manager marching toward him was already waving him toward the gate. "This is a private tour, sir. Paying guests only. I don't know how you got back here, but you need to leave. Now." He'd come in early, before the crowds, walking the vineyard in the same dusty work jacket he'd worn for 30 harvests. A black man among the vines, while well-dressed guests sipped the estate's celebrated wines a few rows over. To Trevor Lang, the tasting room manager, that could only mean one thing: someone who'd wandered onto a VIP tour he hadn't paid for. He was wrong. He was about to be more wrong than he'd ever been on that estate, because the man he was marching off the tour hadn't crashed it. He was the winemaker. His name was on every bottle those guests were drinking, printed across the label of the vintage in their glasses. He had made the wine this whole tour was built to celebrate. Before we find out who the man they threw off the tour really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. His name was Solomon Grant, Soul, to everyone who had ever worked the land beside him, and he was 55 years old, and the wine those guests were swirling and praising had been made by his hands. Soul had not come to winemaking through money, or family land, or a degree from anywhere. He had come to it through dirt. He had started as a teenager in the fields, picking fruit under a hot sun for wages that barely covered the season, one brown body among many in rows that stretched to the horizon. And somewhere in that stooped, aching work he had fallen in love, not with the money, there wasn't any, but with the thing itself. The way a grape told you, if you paid attention, exactly what kind of year it had been. He stayed after the harvest crews packed up and moved on. He asked the old cellar master questions until the man, worn down by the boy's stubbornness, started answering them. The old man's name was Emilio, and he had been making wine since before Soul was born, and he did not want an apprentice, least of all a field kid with dirt under his nails and no pedigree. But Soul kept showing up, at dawn, after his own shift, on his days off, and kept asking, and Emilio, who had watched 100 people pass through the cellar who cared only about the money, slowly came to understand that this one cared about the wine. So he taught him. He taught him to taste from the tank with his eyes closed, to tell a great barrel from a good one by smell, to feel in the skin of a grape what the whole vintage was going to want. And once, near the end, when Soul got something exactly right and grinned about it, Emilio had cuffed him lightly on the back of the head and told him not to get proud, because the wine did not care how clever you were. It only cared how much attention you paid it, and it would tell the truth about that attention in the glass, whether you liked the truth or not. Soul had carried Emilio's cellar in his hands for 30 years. Every bottle with Soul's name on it had a little of the old man's stubborn honesty struck into it, the way a maker's mark is struck into gold. He learned the vines by touch and the barrels by smell, tasting from the tank at dawn before anyone else was awake. And over 30 years, he climbed the one ladder almost nobody climbs, from field hand to cellar hand to assistant winemaker to, finally, the master winemaker, whose palate and patience turned a good estate's wine into something people crossed oceans to drink, and whose name the estate eventually and wisely put on its labels. The old cellar master had told him one thing he never forgot, a thing that became the whole philosophy under everything Soul made, that wine remembers. It remembers every choice and every bit of neglect, every hot afternoon someone didn't come out to check the fruit, every corner someone cut in the cellar. You cannot fake care into a bottle, the old man said. It tastes of exactly how much attention it was given, and no marketing on the label can put back what inattention took out. Soul had built his entire life on that sentence. It had made him patient in a way that had nothing to do with meekness. He could wait out a slow ripening season, a doubting buyer, a room that assumed he was the help, because he trusted that the thing in the glass would, in the end, say what he was more clearly than he ever could himself. And he had needed that patience, because the world had spent 30 years assuming he was the help. There was the wine critic who, at a dinner held in Soul's own honor, had spent 20 minutes praising the vintage to the estate's white sales director, and then turned and asked Sol to bring up another bottle from the cellar. Sol had gone and gotten the bottle. That was the part he thought about afterward, in the car, not the critic's mistake, which was just a man seeing what he expected to see, but his own quiet decision to go, get the bottle rather than correct him, because correcting him would have turned a celebration into a scene, and Sol had a lifetime of practice deciding that the wine mattered more than the credit. He had opened it and poured it, and let the critic go on praising the vintage to the sales director, and only at the very end of the night, when someone finally introduced them properly, had he watched the critic's face do the small, mortified scramble of a man rearranging a picture he'd been certain of an hour before. Sol had been gracious about it. He was always gracious about it. But he had driven home that night and sat in the dark for a while, because there is a specific tiredness that comes from being, again, at your own dinner, the man they assumed would fetch the bottle. There was the distributor at a tasting who'd handed him a case to carry to the car. There were the visitors, year after year, who looked straight through the weathered black man among the vines to find someone who matched their picture of a winemaker. Sol had swallowed all of it because the work was the only argument that ever really won, and a man who stops to correct every doorman never gets the harvest in. But he had promised himself, the day his name finally went on the bottle, that he would spend whatever that name was worth, making the vineyard see the people who were actually in the dirt. 30 years and a famous name had not scrubbed the field out of Solomon Grant. He still woke before dawn during the growing season. He still walked the rows alone. He still crouched to feel the fruit with his own fingers and read the leaves the way a doctor reads a chart, because he did not trust any report as much as he trusted his own hands on the vines, and because the happiest hours of his life had always been the quiet ones out among the plants before the day filled up with people. That was all he had come to do that morning. The fruit was close to ready, days away by the feel of it, and Sol had wanted to walk the vineyard before the tasting room opened and the tour buses arrived, to see the new season for himself in the low gold light, to stand in the rows that would become the next vintage and simply be with them. It was, if he was honest, a kind of prayer for him, that early hour among the vines, the closest thing a practical man raised in the dirt allowed himself to worship. 30 years of fame and a name on a label had not changed what actually moved him, which was never the medals or the scores, but this, a cluster of grapes heavy in his palm at first light, telling him, in a language he had spent his life learning, exactly what kind of wine the year wanted to become. He would not have traded that quiet hour for any dinner in his honor. It was the reason he still came out before the crowds, and it was precisely the thing a manager in a blazer was about to interrupt. He had driven himself out before the crowds in the same dusty canvas work jacket he'd worn for 3 decades, and parked by the equipment sheds like a field hand, and walked out into the vines with nothing but his own 2 hands and 30 years of knowing exactly what to feel for. And it is worth pausing here, before it went wrong, on the fact that it did not have to, because the first person who saw Sol that morning did the right thing without thinking about it. A young vineyard hand named Diego, out early himself checking the irrigation lines, had lifted a hand and called across the rows, "Morning, Mr. Grant. She's looking good this year, isn't she?" And Sol had grinned and called back that she was, that another few days of sun would do it. And the two of them had shared the particular easy warmth of people who both actually worked the land. Diego knew exactly who Sol was, the way everyone who did the real work on that estate knew. To the people in the dirt, Solomon Grant was not a puzzle to be solved. He was the reason the wine was worth making. Sol had crouched at the end of a row then, and lifted a heavy cluster into his palm to check the color and the give of the fruit, the most ordinary act of his entire life, a thing he had done 10 million times, when he heard quick footsteps on the path behind him and a sharp voice telling him he did not belong there. And the morning became a different kind of morning entirely. The man striding down the row was Trevor Lang, 42, and he had run the tasting room and the visitor experience for 3 years, and he had come to mistake the polished public face of the estate for the estate itself. Trevor's whole job was the guest experience, the linen and the stemware, the choreography of a private tour designed to make wealthy visitors feel they had been admitted to something rare. And he guarded the boundary of that experience with a zeal he mistook for excellence. He had a picture in his head of the postcard the estate sold. The golden rose, the elegant guests with their glasses raised, the whole scene curated down to who was allowed to appear in it. Workers belonged in the picture only as distant, picturesque figures among the vines, never up close, never among the guests, never, God forbid, mistaken for one of them. He thought of this as protecting the atmosphere, and he was proud of it, and it had a color to it he had never once made himself look at directly. There had been an incident the previous season that should have taught him something, and hadn't. A picker, a woman who had worked that estate for 15 harvests, who knew those vines better than Trevor ever would, had come up onto the tasting patio to bring a message, and Trevor had ordered her off it in front of a tour group, as though she were trespassing on the property she had helped build, because a woman in field clothes did not fit the postcard. She had said nothing. She had gone back to the rose. Trevor had logged it in the tidy cabinet of his self-regard, as maintaining standards, and had learned precisely nothing because the instinct that sent her off the patio flattered him. It felt like taste, like curation, like a good manager's eye for the scene. And an instinct that flatters you is the single hardest thing in the world to make a man question. So, when Trevor came around the end of a row on his morning circuit and saw, among the vines near a tour that was just assembling, a black man in a dusty work jacket crouched in the dirt with a cluster of grapes in his hand, the picture in his head did not stretch to include him as anyone who mattered. It flagged him. Not a guest. No guest looked like that in Trevor's geometry. A laborer who had wandered too close to the paying visitors, or worse, an outsider who had slipped onto a private tour he hadn't bought. Either way, a smudge on the postcard, to be removed before the guests were troubled by the sight of him. He squared his shoulders, put on the firm voice he used for removing problems, and marched down the row to throw the most important man on the estate off its own land. "Morning," Sewell said, straightening up slowly, the cluster of grapes still cradled in one hand. "Fruit's just about there. Few more days of this sun and we'll be picking." "I'm sure," Trevor said, in a voice that dismissed every word of it. "But this is a private tour for our guests, and you're not on it. So why don't you set those down and head back toward the road before there's a problem?" "Set those down." Sewell looked at the grapes in his palm, then back up at Trevor, and something in him went quietly still. "Son, I've been checking this fruit since before you could drive. I don't need your life story. I need you off this tour." Trevor's smile had gone flat. "I don't know if you're lost or looking for a day's work or what, but our guests are paying for an experience and you're not part of it. So this is the last time I ask nicely. Walk back to the road or I'll call security and they'll walk you." "You could settle this in 1 minute," Sewell said evenly. "Call up to the estate office. Ask for Margaret Hale. Tell her who's standing in the rows. She'll clear it up faster than security will get down here." That should have stopped Trevor. A man who says a private trespasser knows the estate director by first name is not usually a trespasser. It did not stop Trevor. If anything, it irritated him further, because in Trevor's world, a laborer dropping the director's name was exactly the kind of overreach that proved the man didn't know his place. "I'm not bothering Ms. Hale with this," he said. "I'm handling it. Now move." There it was. The refusal to make the one call that would end it, delivered with the breezy confidence of a man who had never once had it turned around on him. A few of the guests had drifted closer, glasses in hand, sensing that something was happening a few rows over. Sewell took in the whole shape of it, the way he took in everything, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned, over 30 years and 100 versions of this morning, exactly how a raised voice from a man who looked like him in front of a crowd like that would be read. And I want to name what he was feeling behind that stillness, because from the outside it looked like nothing, and inside it was old and heavy. Standing in his own vineyard, being told by a man half his age that he did not belong among vines he had tended for 30 years, Sewell was every earlier version of himself at once. The field kid nobody expected anything of, the man handed a case to carry to the car, the guest of honor sent to fetch a bottle at his own dinner. That is the part people who have never felt it do not understand. It is never only the insult in front of you. Each one reaches back and touches all the others, and for a moment you are every age you have ever been, while someone decided you were less. Sewell felt all of it, and kept his hand steady around the cluster of grapes and his voice low, because he had learned that his calm was the one thing men like Trevor could never take from him, and because he had decided, long ago, out among Emilio's barrels, that he would not hand it over to anyone who had not earned the right to disturb it. "Make the call, Trevor," Sewell said quietly, reading the name off the little brass tag on the man's vest. "That's all. One call before you do the thing you're about to do." Trevor did not make the call. Making the call would have taken 1 minute, and it would have ended his career far more gently than what was actually coming. Instead, he unclipped his radio and called for security, loudly, so the guests could hear him take charge of the situation. A member of the estate's ground security did come, an older man named Walsh who had worked the property a long time. But Walsh arrived to find not a threat, but a weathered man standing calmly in the rows with a cluster of grapes in his hand, guests filming, and Trevor red-faced and pointing, and Walsh's instincts, built from years of actually knowing the place rather than from Trevor's anxieties, told him at once that something was off. He did not lay a hand on Sewell. He looked at the man's face, and something flickered, recognition half-formed, and he said, low, "Trevor, you sure about this one? He looks like..." and trailed off because he could not quite place it and did not want to be wrong in either direction. Trevor snapped at him to just stand by, and Walsh stood by, but he stood by at a careful distance with his hands loose at his sides, a man making very sure the footage would show he had touched no one. Even the muscle Trevor summoned to enforce his certainty could see, at a glance, that the certainty was wrong. Let me stop here and tell you what Trevor Lang did not know, because it turns this from an ugly moment into something far larger. The wine those guests were swirling and praising, the vintage this entire tour existed to celebrate, here had Solomon Grant's name printed across the label. There was a bottle of it standing open on the tasting table at the end of the row at that very moment, and Trevor had carried it out and set it there himself an hour earlier without once reading the name on it. Sewell wasn't a laborer who'd wandered in. He was the winemaker whose palate had built the estate's reputation, whose name was on the release notes in every guest's welcome packet, whose portrait hung in the barrel cellar the tour was about to visit, beside a shelf of the medals his wines had won. The estate director had cleared her whole morning to walk him personally through the new vintage, and more than one of the guests on that VIP tour had booked it, and paid a small fortune for it, specifically for the chance to meet the legend whose name was on the bottle, a legend they were, at that moment, watching get, wave toward the gate without recognizing him at all. Every proof was in the Vineyard. One of them was printed on the bottle in a guest's own hand. One hung on the cellar wall 100 yards away. And Trevor was reaching for his radio to call security. Now, here is the part worth sitting with, because Sewell made a choice, and he made it on purpose. He could have ended it in one sentence. "I'm Solomon Grant. That's my name on the bottle you poured these people. Say it and watch Trevor Lang come apart." And part of him, the part that was 30 years tired of being asked to prove he belonged among his own vines, wanted to. But Sewell had learned something over those 30 years that most people never get the chance to learn. The triumphant reveal teaches the Trevors of the world nothing at all. If he pulled rank now and watched the man crumble, Trevor would learn exactly one lesson, that he'd had the bad luck to wave off the wrong black man this time. He'd apologize the way people apologize for getting caught, and the instinct that had come marching down that row would go home and sleep soundly and come marching just as fast the next morning, aimed at the next worker who didn't fit the postcard and had no bottle with his name on it to prove otherwise. Sewell did not want to teach Trevor Lang that he'd insulted a VIP. He wanted to see, and some watchful part of him wanted the guests' phones to see, Exactly how far this man would take it against someone he was completely certain was nobody. Because that was the true measure of Trevor Lang, and of the beautiful estate with Soul's name on its labels, and of how the place actually treated the people in the dirt when the famous name wasn't attached to them. If you have ever been treated like the hired help on ground you had poured your own life into, then you already know the exact weight of this moment. So, if it's landing, take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps carry this story to the next person who's lived it. And stay with me because the estate director is about to come up that row and Trevor Lang's morning is about to end. There was a young man a couple of rows over who understood exactly what he was watching, and his name was Diego. Diego was 25, a vineyard hand who also led the smaller, less glamorous tours when the estate was short, 2 years on the land, and he had learned exactly what it meant to work under Trevor Lang. Keep the workers out of sight of the guests. Don't let the postcards slip. Trevor had a way of treating the people who actually grew and made the wine as scenery that ought to stay in the background, and Diego had felt the edge of it himself, been shooed off the tasting patio more than once for the crime of being visibly a laborer near paying visitors. He had swallowed it because he needed the job. He was sending money home and taking a viticulture course at night, dreaming of the cellar, and a man in his position did not pick fights with the manager who wrote his schedule. He had come up almost exactly the way Sewell had, a generation later. A kid who started in the rows because it was the work available and stayed because somewhere in the stooped labor he fell for the thing itself. He kept a battered textbook in his truck and read it on his breaks. He had a plan, and the plan had no slack in it. 2 years in the vines, the night course, and then, if he was very lucky and worked without stopping, a chance at the cellar. Trevor held a piece of that plan in his hand every time he made the schedule, and Diego knew it, and had spent 18 months being careful because of it, which is why, when he turned and ran up that row for Margaret Hale, he was not spending a gesture. He was spending the plan, the schedule, the reference, the shot at the cellar, on the chance that doing the right thing this once would not quietly cost him all of it. But this was different, and Diego could feel it, because Diego knew precisely who was standing in that row. Everyone who actually worked the land did. He watched Trevor march up to Solomon Grant, and start waving him toward the gate like a stray. And he felt something rise in his chest that 1.5 years of keeping his head down had taught him to press back down. "Trevor," he said, coming closer, his voice tight. Hold on, you don't know who that is. That's Mr. Grant. That's the winemaker." "I don't care if he's the gardener, Diego. He's not on my tour." Trevor still had not really looked at Saul's face. He was too busy performing authority for the guests. "Go make yourself useful and help me walk him to the road." And Diego stood at the exact fork in the road that fear builds for people who need their jobs. Obey the man who controlled his hours and his shot at the cellar, or do the thing he knew was right and find out what it cost. For 1.5 years, he had chosen the schedule. He looked at Sewell. He looked at the bottle standing open on the tasting table with the name on it that Trevor would not read. And he made a different choice this time. He did not help walk anyone anywhere. He turned and ran, full out, down the long road toward the main house, to get the estate director before it got any worse. It was the bravest thing he had done on that land, and it did not feel brave. It felt like his heart trying to climb out of his chest while his legs did the thing his fear had been talking him out of for 18 months. By now, a couple of the guests had stopped pretending not to watch. One, a woman with a glass of the estate's flagship red, the very wine Sewell had made, had quietly lifted her phone and begun to record because the scene had crossed a line she could feel before she could name it. A manager in a blazer waving a calm older man out of the vines like a trespasser. One of the guests said something about it, to Trevor's back. "He hasn't done anything," the woman with the phone said, clearly in the crisp voice of someone used to being heard. "He's been standing in a vineyard looking at grapes. Why are you doing this?" Trevor, flustered, said something about the tour being private and the man not being on his list. and the woman looked at him with plain distaste and kept filming because she had already understood the shape of what she was watching, even if she didn't yet know the man's name. It changed nothing about Trevor's course. He had planted his flag in front of the guests and could not retreat from it now. But it told Sewell something, and it told the little group something too, about exactly whose comfort Trevor had built his whole idea of the estate around, and whose he had never once thought to consider. The charge among the little group had shifted, the way it always does, from a tour glitch into something uglier, and Trevor could feel the eyes on him and mistook the discomfort for the tension of a manager handling a problem. Well, when it was really a dozen people slowly understanding that they were on the wrong side of something. The woman who came up the row at a fast, uneven pace, one hand holding her hat against the breeze, was Margaret Hale, the estate director, and she had worked alongside Solomon Grant for a decade, had watched his wines take the medals that hung in the cellar, had cleared her entire morning to walk him through the new vintage barrel by barrel. She knew his face better than she knew almost anyone's on the property. And when a breathless young Vineyard hand came pounding up to the house saying Trevor's trying to throw Mr. Grant off the tour, she was moving before Diego finished the sentence. She came up the row and saw it. Her tasting room manager squared up against the estate's own winemaker, waving him toward the gate, a cluster of grapes still in Saul's hand and a crowd of paying guests watching it happen. "Trevor!" Her voice carried down the rows. "Trevor, stop! Step back from him, right now." "Ms. Hale, good," Trevor said, and his shoulders loosened with relief, because in his mind, reinforcement had arrived. "I've got a trespasser in the vines, some fellow who won't leave, I'm handling. That is Solomon Grant." Each word landed flat and hard. "That is our winemaker. That is the man whose name is on the bottle you poured for these guests this morning. That is the reason every one of these people is standing in this vineyard at all. You have spent the last 10 minutes threatening to have security remove the man who made the wine on your own tasting table." And it was at that exact moment that one of the guests, an older gentleman who had, it turned out, flown in specifically for this tour, stepped forward with his glass and said, with dawning delight and dawning horror in equal measure, "Wait, Solomon Grant. We've been asking all morning when we'd get to meet Grant. You've been throwing out Grant?" Across the vineyard, the young hand named Diego felt something come loose in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched because he had spent a year and a half being told, in 100 small ways, that Trevor's picture of who belonged among the guests was right, and his own knowledge of who mattered was to be kept quiet. And here, in front of everyone, in the space of a minute, the two pictures had traded places. If you have ever waited for the moment the truth finally arrives in a place that refused to see it, take 1 second and leave a like. It genuinely carries this story to the next person who's been the one nobody believed. And stay with me, because Trevor Lang is about to reach for the oldest excuse there is, and Solomon Grant is going to answer it with something far heavier than anger. The color drained out of Trevor Lang's face. For a moment, he simply could not take it in. His eyes went to the tasting table at the end of the row, to the open bottle standing there, the one he had carried out and set down himself, and, as if seeing it for the very first time, to the name printed across its label, Grant. The same name Margaret had just said. Then back to the weathered man in the dusty jacket, and the two resolved into one, and 3 years of certainty came apart under him all at once. "Mr. Grant," he managed. "Sir, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I didn't recognize you. You were just standing I was just standing in a vineyard in work clothes." Sewell finished the sentence for him, quietly, and the quiet of it landed harder than any shout. "Which is what a man who makes wine does. I know I don't look like the postcard, Trevor. I've spent 30 years not looking like the postcard, out here in the dirt, while other people poured what I made and took the compliments for it." He looked at him, not with hatred, but with a tired, bone-deep disappointment. "But I want to be precise with you, because that isn't actually what went wrong here. It doesn't matter that you failed to recognize the winemaker. What matters is that you looked at a black man in a work jacket, hurting no one, standing among the vines he tends, and decided, before you looked at his face, before you made one phone call, that he was a trespasser to be marched off. You'd have done that to any of the people who actually grow this wine. That my name happens to be on the bottle is the least important thing about this morning. It's just the only part that's going to cost you. Mr. Grant, please. Trevor's voice had climbed. 3 years I've given this estate. One mistake, one bad read on a busy morning. Was it one? Sewell asked, not cruelly, almost curious. Because I've been in these rows for 10 minutes, and in 10 minutes I watched you decide what I was on site, refuse the one phone call that would have told you the truth, and reach for security when I wouldn't hurry off fast enough. That's not a man having one bad morning. That's a routine, a smooth one. His eyes moved to Diego, just for a moment, and back. I don't think this was your first time walking someone off this land who didn't fit your picture. I think it's the first time you were wrong about who they'd turn out to be. Then he did the thing that separated this from a story about revenge. He turned to Margaret Hale and said evenly, "Whatever the cameras caught of this, the gate, the tasting patio, I want it kept, and I don't want a word of trouble landing on the young man who ran up to get you. Diego. He's the only person out here this morning who did the right thing, at a cost to himself, and I want that remembered right. 30 years in the dirt had taught him that the record of how people get treated is the only thing that reliably protects the ones who can't protect themselves. The pickers, the cellar hands, the people with no name on any bottle. He was not preserving the footage out of vengeance. He was preserving it because a documented wrong can be answered, and an undocumented one just becomes the manager's word against the workers, and Sewell had spent his whole life watching whose word came out on top. And then, before any of the consequences began, Sewell did the thing he had actually driven out early to do. He left the guests and the manager and the whole ugly scene behind him and walked down into the barrel cellar alone. It was cool and dim and quiet down there, the way it had been in Emilio's day, the air thick with the smell of oak and fermenting fruit, and Sewell walked the rows of barrels with one hand trailing along the staves, tasting the new vintage from the tank, with his eyes half closed, reading it the way the old man had taught him. On the wall hung the medals, and the portrait the estate had insisted on, and Sewell barely glanced at either. The medals had never been the point. The point was the wine, and the wine was good. He could feel the care in it, the attention, 30 years of it, and he stood alone among the barrels and let himself have the quiet joy of it, the thing he had come for, the thing Trevor Lang had tried and failed to take. He had come to be with his wine. He was with his wine. The manager's certainty could not follow him down here, into the one place that had only ever judged him by the truth in the glass. Trevor Lang did not keep his job, and the way it ended was quiet, which is worse than loud. There was a meeting 2 days later in the estate office, and the security footage from the gate and the tasting patio played on a screen without commentary while a few people watched it. Sewell, Margaret, and someone from the estate's ownership. They let it run. Trevor watched himself march down the row. He watched himself wave a man out of the vines and refuse, again and again, the one phone call that would have ended it, while that man asked him evenly just to check with the office. When it was over, he began to talk about the 3 years, about the busy morning, about the impossible position, about how anyone might have made the same read. And Sewell let him finish, and then said the only thing he said in that meeting. "You keep telling us what you saw. Nobody here is arguing about what you saw. We're telling you that what you saw was the problem." There was nothing to answer that with, because it was exactly true, and some part of Trevor, perhaps for the first time, understood it. He was let go that week, not, the record was careful to state, for the embarrassment of having thrown out the winemaker, but for what the footage plainly showed, he would have done to any worker who looked like him and lacked a bottle with his name on it. The footage did what footage does now. The guest with the phone had caught it, and within days a clip of a vineyard manager waving a black man out of the rows, a man whose name was on the very bottle the guests were drinking, had traveled far past wine country. The estate, whose entire brand was built on the romance of its legendary winemaker, had the uniquely mortifying problem of having been caught on its own cameras trying to remove that legend from his own vines. And it moved quickly to make clear that the man in the blazer did not represent the place. Trevor would not run a tasting room again at that level. That is a real and heavy consequence, and I won't pretend it isn't. But Sewell did more than remove one manager. And this is the part that mattered to him. He went and found the picker from the previous season, the woman who had worked the estate for 15 harvests and been ordered off the tasting patio like a trespasser on ground she had helped build. He didn't send an assistant. He found her himself, out in the rows where she was most at home, and he apologized plainly for a thing that had not been his to prevent, but was his to answer now. And then he did something better than an apology. He asked her to be part of the new tour, to stand among the vines she knew better than anyone and tell the guests, in her own words, what it actually takes to grow the fruit that goes into the bottle. She did. Visitors who used to sip in front of a pretty, peopleless backdrop now shook the hand of one of the people whose work was in their glass. That, Sewell told Margaret, was the real repair, not Trevor's firing, which was only the removal of a broken part, but going back and putting the invisible people at the center of the story where they had belonged all along. The changes he and Margaret made across the estate were unglamorous, and Sewell preferred them that way because he distrusted anything that felt like a gesture. They ended the unwritten rule that kept the crews out of the guests' sightline. They built the workers into the tour itself, as guides and voices and not as scenery. They made a plain, protected channel for a hand in the rows to report the next Trevor without gambling a season's work on it. And they started tracking a number the estate had never bothered to keep, not just the wine sold and the scores earned, but the people who worked that land and how they were treated, because Sewell had learned from Emilio that you cannot fix what you refuse to measure, and that the estate's real character was not in the medals on the cellar wall, but in how it treated the person with dirt under their nails when no famous name was attached to them. And here's the uncomfortable part, because the story is a lie if I skip it. Trevor Lang got caught because he happened to wave off the one worker whose name was on the label. Strip that accident away, and what's left is a manager who was, by the estate's conventional measures, good at his job for 3 years, where being good at his job quietly meant keeping the people in the dirt out of the postcard and being thanked for the atmosphere it produced. For every Trevor who throws out the winemaker and detonates his career on camera, there are 100 still running 100 tasting rooms, doing the smaller, safer version to the pickers and the cellar hands and the day laborers who will never have a bottle with their name on it, and calling it curation. The camera found this one. The only question the story really leaves you with is how many it never finds. Now, let me tell you what happened to everyone else, because one firing is not the same thing as justice, and the two need to be counted separately. Diego did not lose his job. He got a much better one. Solomon Grant does not forget the person who does the right thing when it is costly. And a 25-year-old vineyard hand who told his own manager the truth and then ran for the director, knowing exactly what it might cost him, was precisely that person. Sewell sought him out a few days later, and he didn't make a production of it. He just found Diego in the rows and said, "You told Trevor the truth when it would have been easier to help him walk me off. You knew what he could do to your hours, to your shot at the cellar, and you ran for Margaret instead. You know how rare that is?" Diego started to say it was nothing, that anyone would have, and Sewell stopped him, the way a man who once picked fruit for pennies learns to stop that sentence in someone else. "It was the whole thing," he said. "Everyone else out here found a reason to stand still. You didn't. Don't you ever let anybody tell you it was small." He learned that Diego was taking a viticulture course at night and dreaming of the cellar, and he took him on as a cellar apprentice, teaching him the barrels and the blending the same slow way the old master had once taught Sewell, tasting from the tank at dawn, learning that wine remembers everything. The first time Diego got a blend right on his own, a small trial lot, nothing that would ever reach a bottle, but right, balanced, alive. Sewell had tasted it and gone quiet for a moment, and then done the thing Emilio had once done to him, cuffed him lightly on the back of the head, and told him not to get proud, because the wine didn't care how clever he was, only how much attention he paid it. Diego had grinned so wide it hurt. He understood, standing there in the cool of the cellar, with the old man's lesson coming down to him across 2 generations, that he had come all the way from the rows to the barrels, the road almost nobody gets to walk, and that the door had been held open for him by a legend who had once, on a golden morning, very nearly been marched off this land by a man who couldn't see either of them. And Sewell used the morning the way he used a bad harvest, as a lesson to be studied, not just survived. He and Margaret changed how the estate treated the people who worked the land, brought the crews out of the picturesque distance and into the story, put the pickers and cellar hands on the tour to speak for their own work, and built a way for the Diegos of the estate to report the next Trevor without gambling their jobs on it. None of it made a headline. All of it changed, season over season, who felt seen on that land. That, and not one man's firing, was the thing Sewell had walked the rows that morning to protect. There is one last picture I want to leave you with from the following harvest. A tour came through at golden hour, and at the end of it, instead of the usual peopleless view of the vines, the guests were introduced to the crew that had just brought the fruit in, sunburned, dust-caked, proud, and to the cellar, apprentice who would help turn that fruit into wine. On that particular tour, as it happened, was the older gentleman who had flown in the season before, the one who had realized in real time that the estate was throwing out the very winemaker he'd come to meet. He had written to Sewell afterward, a plain and decent letter saying he was ashamed of what he'd witnessed and glad of how it had ended, and he had asked to come back. Now he stood at the end of the rows and watched a crew be thanked by name and a young apprentice explain the fruit, and when Sewell himself came out to greet the group, which he did now, on purpose, no longer hidden in the cellar. The gentleman shook his hand for a long moment and said only that it was an honor and that he'd buy a case of whatever Sewell was proudest of, and that he wanted to hear the whole of how it was made. Sewell told him. That too was part of what had changed. The man whose name was on the bottle no longer had to prove he belonged among his own vines, and the people who filled that bottle no longer had to stand out of the frame while strangers drank their work. The apprentice, in a work jacket not unlike the one his mentor wore, told the guests how to read a cluster of grapes with your own hand, and watch their faces change as they understood, maybe for the first time, that the beautiful thing in their glass came from beautiful, back-breaking human work. That apprentice was Diego. He never mentioned that he had once nearly been made to walk a legend off that very land, or that the legend had taught him, without either of them quite saying it, that the whole point of putting your name on a bottle is to make sure the people who filled it get seen too. That is what changed, not that one manager was fired, that the workers came into the picture. Sewell thought, sometimes, that Emilio's old line about the wine was the truest thing anyone had ever taught him, and that it was not really about wine at all. Wine remembers everything that is done to it, every bit of care and every bit of neglect, and it tells the truth about that treatment in the glass, no matter what the label says. Places are the same, he came to believe. An estate remembers how it treated the people in its dirt, and that memory ends up in everything it makes, in a way no marketing can cover. Trevor Lang had spent 3 years selling the label and neglecting the vineyard's own people, and it had very nearly cost the estate everything, because that kind of neglect always tells, eventually. Sewell spent the rest of his career making sure the estate that bore his name would remember its people kindly, so that the care would end up where it belonged, in the glass. Let me leave you with the thing underneath all of it. Trevor Lang looked at a man and saw a trespasser because he was black and dressed for work and standing among the vines. And the man had made the wine, and his name was on the bottle, and his portrait hung in the cellar. That is the irony, and it is a clean one, and it is why the story travels. But the irony is not the point, and I don't want you to leave thinking it is. The point is the thing Sewell said in the rows, quiet and level, with the grape still in his hand, that it did not matter that Trevor failed to recognize the winemaker, that the real wrong is what the same glance does, every day, To the pickers and the cellar hands and the people who do the actual work and will never have a bottle with their name on it, who deserve to be seen on that land anyway, before anyone knows who they are. A world where you have to be the name on the label to be allowed to stand in the vineyard has fixed nothing at all. It has only, once in a great while, by pure accident, aimed its contempt at the one man the whole estate was built to celebrate. So let me ask you what I always ask, because your answers are the best part of doing this. Have you ever been treated like the hired help, invisible in the way, told to move along, on ground you had poured your own work into? And what did you make of how Sewell handled it? The calm, the offered phone call, the saved footage, the choice to lift up the workers instead of just savoring one man's bad morning. Would you have kept that composure? I'm honestly not sure I could. Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them, and if this story moved you, do the small things that carry it to the next person. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're not already here, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that the people who do the real work deserve to be seen doing it. Thank you truly for spending this time with me. Take care of each other, shake the hand of the person the room would rather keep in the background, and I'll see you in the next one.